They underestimated her, big time. What they didn't know was that behind her calm demeanor was someone with the strength, wit, and training to handle far worse than a group of bullies. As their taunts escalated, the entire restaurant watched, holding their breath. No one could have predicted what happened next. Let's just say they messed with the wrong person that night. The tension in the diner was thick. The bikers, clearly enjoying the attention, leaned closer to the nurse's table, their smirks growing wider with every snide comment. "What's a pretty lady like you doing here all alone?" One of them sneered, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she calmly sipped her coffee, her expression unreadable. The other diners shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. But the nurse didn't seem fazed. If anything, there was a quiet confidence about her, like she'd been in worse situations before. What no one else in the room knew was that she wasn't just a nurse. She was trained to stay calm under pressure, think quickly, and protect herself. Still, the bikers continued, unaware of what they were walking into. One of them reached for her plate, and that's when everything started to change. As the biker's hand hovered over her plate, the nurse finally looked up, locking eyes with him. Her gaze wasn't angry or fearful. It was calm, steady, and strangely unsettling. "That's not yours," she said, her voice low but firm. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The biker froze for a moment, clearly not expecting her to push back. But his hesitation quickly turned into a chuckle as he withdrew his hand, trying to play it off. "You've got some guts," he said, leaning in closer. The other bikers laughed, egging him on. But the nurse didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly stood up, her movements measured and deliberate. The other diners watched, some nervously shifting in their seats. What they didn't know was that the nurse had noticed something the rest hadn't, a subtle but crucial detail about the group that changed everything. The biker leaned back with a smirk, thinking he'd won this little standoff. The nurse, however, didn't back down. Instead, she glanced at the clock on the wall, as if calculating something. "You've had your fun," she said evenly, her voice calm but commanding. "I suggest you leave now." Her words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that made even the other diners sit up straighter. The gang burst into laughter, their leader pounding the table as if her words were the punchline of a joke. "And what are you gonna do about it, sweetheart?" he said, grinning, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. The move wasn't aggressive, but it was deliberate. The mood shifted. One of the bikers nudged the leader, whispering something that made his grin falter for just a second. The nurse had seen it too, a tiny crack in their bravado. She didn't have to raise her voice. The quiet confidence in her presence was enough to make them realize they'd underestimated her. Still, they weren't ready to back down completely. One of them stood, towering over her, as the room held its breath. The tension was unbearable, and everyone waited to see what would happen next. The towering biker loomed over her, his shadow casting across the table. "You think that little phone's gonna scare us?" he growled, his voice low and threatening. The nurse didn't blink. Instead, she pressed a few buttons on her phone, her expression calm but focused. "It's not about scaring you," she said simply, slipping the phone back into her bag. The biker leaned in closer, but before he could say another word, the faint sound of sirens began to echo in the distance. His face tightened for just a moment, a flicker of panic he tried to mask with bravado. The gang exchanged uneasy glances, and the leader shot a glare at the nurse, realizing she'd made a calculated move. But what none of them knew was that the nurse hadn't just called for help. Her phone's camera had been recording the entire exchange, capturing every word in action. She had more than enough evidence to turn the tables on them, and the gang was beginning to realize just how precarious their situation had become. As the sirens grew louder, the leader slammed his fist on the table. "We're not done here," he hissed, but even his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The nurse didn't respond. She simply stood there, calm and unshaken, as the gang tried to decide their next move. The tension reached its breaking point, and the entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen when those doors opened. The game froze as the sound of sirens grew deafeningly close, the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the diner's windows. The leader gritted his teeth, clearly torn between standing his ground and making a run for it. But before anyone could move, the door swung open, not with the police, but with two men in uniforms. They weren't officers. They were paramedics. The nurse smiled faintly as they approached her, their expressions serious but respectful. "You okay?" one of them asked. She nodded. "Thanks for coming so quickly," she said, her calm voice cutting through the tension. The bikers looked confused, and for a moment, the leader sneered. "You called an ambulance." "For what, lady?" he mocked. But the nurse didn't answer him. Instead, she turned to the paramedics and said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "There's a man at the back table showing signs of cardiac distress. I've been monitoring him, but he needs immediate attention." The entire diner turned to look at a quiet man in the corner, pale and clutching his chest. The bikers were stunned into silence, their bravado completely deflated. The leader's face darkened, realizing they'd made fools of themselves and in front of someone who had been saving a life right under their noses. As the paramedics worked quickly to assist the man, the sirens outside faded as the police car pulled away. It had been a passing coincidence, but it was enough to rattle the gang. The nurse picked up her bag and turned to leave. Before stepping out, she glanced back at the leader, her expression calm but firm. "Next time, pick someone your own size, or smarter." The bikers didn't respond. They just stood there, stunned and silent, as she walked out the door, leaving them to face the consequences of their arrogance. As the nurse stepped outside into the cool night air, the tension of the diner faded behind her. She glanced back briefly, seeing the bikers now awkwardly quiet, their earlier bravado replaced with unease. Inside, the paramedics worked swiftly, the other diners returning to their meals with whispered conversations about what had just unfolded. Walking to her car, the nurse took a deep breath, a small smile playing on her lips. It wasn't the first time she'd had to stand her ground, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Her job had taught her to handle chaos with calm precision, whether in a hospital room or a diner. As she drove away, she hoped the bikers had learned a lesson, not just about respecting others, but about how little they truly understood the strength of the people they underestimated. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has the loudest impact.